That rhetoric guy. One of the most common mistakes students make when learning rhetoric is to put too much focus and effort on the small scale. They device hunt for an illusion or a hyperbole or parallel structure. While this tactic certainly gives beginners something concrete to hold on to, it misses the bigger point of rhetoric. For example, how does finding one hyperbole in a 10-page speech really help us understand that author's comprehensive persuasion strategy? Well, it doesn't. And this is commonly called missing the forest for the trees. That is, we're missing the big picture because we're too focused on the individual components. Well, this video is my attempt to shine some light on the grand strategies of persuasion and to train you to think big. All right, so a good place to start, and notice I am saying start and not end, is with the common appeals, ethos, logos, pathos. Now, if you've seen my video on the subject, you should know that these are signposts for the general ways in which we appeal to one another. Ethos, I want you to trust my judgment because of my experience. Logos, I want you to analyze the data because it is the most scientific. Pathos, I want you to feel so badly about your own position that you're forced to adopt my position. Notice that each of these are relational. They involve connections between speaker, message, and audience. And if you leave out a part or miss a part of that relationship, you won't be able to see the grand battle plan of the speaker. Here's an example to aid with your thinking. The New York Times compiled a list of Donald Trump's Twitter insults. One of the most common is his constant use of a single descriptive word attached to a name. Now, if I wanted to device hunt and be super specific, this is called an epithet, like Richard the Lionheart or Gray-Eyed Athena. And in this case, the epithet is crooked, as in Crooked Hillary. But simply pointing out the fact that he constantly uses epithets, this doesn't really help us understand why he does it or how it could influence and persuade an audience. So if instead we looked at this epithet under the bigger lens of the appeals, we could tie together the pathos, in this case, the negative emotional reactions his base would have to a word like crooked, with his projected ethos. In this case, he wants to be seen as a populist figure who is just rooting out corruption. If we're able to connect those things, then we're able to actually explain his large-scale strategy that Trump uses emotionally loaded language to stoke his audience's hatred of corruption. This explanation has a lot more real-life value and durability. It teaches us how his language is used on a large scale, rather than simply pointing out the fact that he uses epithets a lot. But as I pointed out in my appeals video, ethos, logos, and pathos are not the only kinds of appeals, nor do they offer any kind of context to rhetorical strategy. Notice that in that previous example, I had to kind of stretch and connect the dots myself. So is there a middle ground? Something that is broad and general enough, like the appeals, but something that is also a little bit more specific and contextualized? Well, the short answer is not that I have found. But the longer answer is yes, I've come up with some guideposts for students to use that go beyond the traditional appeals. And these are not in any way formal names, but simply common strategies that I've seen people use. For each of these, I have one, a general term that would encompass the strategy. In other words, I've given it a made-up name. This is not a label that you would want to use in an essay, but rather just a name like Pathos that is a signpost for things that you should look for. Two, a breakdown of how and why such a strategy might be used. And then three, a real-life example to kind of solidify it in your head. The first strategy that you might want to look for is a strategy of comparison or balance. The author is trying to make things equal or make them seem similar. Or maybe the author is trying to develop a kind of symmetry or connection across things that seem different. Why? Why would an author do that? Well, one, people are kind of emotionally drawn to symmetrical things. For example, humans find symmetrical faces more attractive than non-symmetrical faces. Maybe the author wants to point out a logical flaw in our way of thinking and show that things that we think are different are actually kind of similar. For example, we might see many differences in words like pro-choice and pro-life when they're actually a lot more connected than we might imagine. Pro-choice could mean the choice to not have an abortion, and pro-life could mean having an abortion to save the life of the mother. How might you use this kind of strategy? Well, one, I've used it a couple of times in my videos so far. Analogies, telling a comparative story. Another easy way to do this is using a semicolon. A semicolon is a period that's not a period. You would have two complete independent sentences, but instead of putting a period between them, you put a semicolon because you want to relate those two complete ideas. So a semicolon has a shorter pause than a period and shows that there's a kind of cause and effect relationship between those two sentences. Maybe that's a strategy on the author's part to make you feel as if these sentences are connected when you otherwise wouldn't have seen that. So one example of this might be the U.S.'s Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, one of the main writers, had a very clear drive towards balance. And you can see this in the beginning of the Declaration as there's this logical chain of positions, each one tied to the next with an eye toward balance. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Another strategy to look for might be the opposite of that. A strategy geared towards contrast and opposites. The author is trying to make things unequal or seem different. Maybe they're trying to develop discord between things that seem harmonious. Why might someone want to do this? Well, this is often used to redefine common thinking or to challenge people's expectations. For example, contrasting Republicans and Democrats might force the audience to recognize that those are not the only two options. Sometimes contrast is used to point out irony or hypocrisy. For example, showing a family values politician pushing for offensive war, Well, that would clearly reveal that the politician isn't consistent. How would this work? Well, a really common thing to do is juxtapose. Put two things that are dissimilar, smash them together. That close proximity begins to highlight their relationship, their differences, and their similarities. And indeed, irony is exactly this, showing that the actual result undermines the expected result. An example of this could be in Patrick Henry's "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death" speech. It has this section that contrasts America's attempts at peace with Britain's reactions of war. Judging by the past, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct of the British ministry for the past 10 years to justify those hopes with which these gentlemen have been pleased to solace themselves in the House. Is it that insidious smile with which our petition has been lately received? Trust it not, sir. It will prove a snare to your feet. Suffer not yourselves to be betrayed with a kiss. Ask yourselves how this gracious reception of our petition comports with these warlike preparations which cover our waters and darken our land. Are fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? Have we shown ourselves so unwilling to be reconciled that force must be called in to win back our love? Let us not deceive ourselves, sir. These are the implements of war and subjugation, the last arguments to which kings resort. And the last strategy I'll offer as a way of thinking is one of amplification or diminishment, making things seem of greater importance or of lesser importance. Why might you want to do this? Well, one is simply to get your audience emotionally involved. Constantly making fun of your opponent's position might shame them out of their position and into yours. Maybe you want to overwhelm your audience with repetition so that it seems like your position is inevitable. How might you do this? Well, there's some simple tactics like using lots of hyperboles or a constant stream of understatement. But it might actually help you to learn how to write satirically and sarcastically. Those are not easy styles to master, but if you can master them, amplifying or diminishing things will become a lot easier for you. Here's an example of amplification used in a patriotic sense. This is from Churchill's "Blood, Toil, Tears, and Sweat" speech. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all the might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory, there is no survival. Let that be realized. No survival for the British Empire. No survival for all the British Empire has stood for. No survival for the urge and impulse of the ages that mankind will move forward toward its goal. So, to summarize, our focus shouldn't be on individual words or phrases, but rather on the overall movement of a speaker's words. Thinking strategically about the large-scale concepts like the ethos built by trustworthiness, or the beauty created by symmetry, or the hypocrisy revealed by contrast, or the emotion stoked by amplification, or the logic critiqued by comparison. This kind of strategic thinking teaches us much more about the whys and the hows of communication than any individual device. And ultimately, this is rhetoric's strength, training the mind to see persuasion as a strategic series of choices.